to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I pay my respects to elders past, present and future, and acknowledge the knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of this country. Now, please remember to turn your phones to silent. You are welcome to take photos, but please turn your flash off and share your thoughts and pictures on any of Roaring Stories' social media channels, including Instagram, Twitter and Facebook, with the hashtags Roaring Stories and Life After Truth. Now, we will have time for questions later, so if you'd like to ask Ceridwen a question, you'll have time to do so in the Royal Oak. And if you're on Facebook Live, please post your questions in the comments under the video now, and I'll ask them for you later. Now, I was struck by the difference between my 10th and 20th year high school reunions. You know, how the brash young people that had tried to impress everyone at how successful they'd become. I remember people turning up in hired limousines to show how well they were doing, saying that they were in property development, although really they were just doing the filing in their dad's real estate agency. But it's amazing, isn't it? By the time I got to my 20th reunion, those same people had grown into mostly happy, mostly successful, middle-aged parents, just like me. But they don't call it a midlife crisis for nothing, do they? As John Lennon famously said, life is what happens when you're busy making plans. And it struck me as I get older how between kids and work and the mortgage and everything else, how quickly so many of my dreams have turned into, well, regrets. I never did get to South America. I'm still writing that novel. Thanks. At least I've got my looks, I guess. I mean, a lot of people tell me how great I look for 58. Sadly, though, I'm only 46. Anyway, it seems that as I left uni, the future seemed to kind of stretch out with infinite promise. And yet now, the past seems to loom closer and closer, just as I run out of days left. You know, it kind of strikes me that I may have less days to live than I have already lived. So, for the 5 close friends on the cusp of middle age in Ceridwen Dovey's wonderful new novel, Life After Truth, who've lived very different lives after graduating from the venerable Harvard University, that same swirl of pleasures and hopes and regrets come together at their 15th reunion as they wonder if they've wasted their youthful dreams and opportunities. You've got Jules, a famous actor when she arrived on campus, who's changing in mysterious ways but won't share what's haunting her. Mariam and Rowan, who married young and are struggling with the demands of family life and starting to regret prioritising meaning over wealth in their careers. Eloise, a professor who studies the psychology of happiness, is troubled by her young wife's increasingly radical politics. And Jomo, the founder of a luxury jewellery company, has been carrying an engagement ring around in his pocket for months, unsure whether his girlfriend really is the one. And as their secrets and soul-searching come to a head over that weekend, the most infamous member of their class, Frederick, senior advisor and son of the recently elected and much loathed US president, turns up dead. Lyrical, resonant and gripping, Life After Truth is a novel for our times, no matter what stage of life we're at. And our guest tonight is about as accomplished as everybody in the novel. Born in South Africa and growing up between there and Australia, Ceridwen Dovey writes fiction, creative non-fiction, in-depth essays and profiles. After winning a scholarship to Harvard University, she completed postgraduate studies in social anthropology at New York University and completed an MA in creative writing at Cape Town University. Her 2007 debut novel, Blood Kin, was shortlisted for the Dylan Thomas Award and selected for the US National Book Foundation's prestigious 5 Under 35 honours list. Her second book, 2014's Only the Animals, won the inaugural Readings New Australian Writing Award, the Steel Rudd Award for a short story collection at the Queensland Literary Awards, and was co-winner of the People's Choice Award for Fiction at the 2015 New South Wales Premier's Literary Awards. The book's on the VCE Literature Text Selection for Victorian high school students, and her 2018 novel, In the Garden of the Fugitives, described by the New York Times as an elegant, impressive, thought-provoking novel, was longlisted for the 2019 Australian Book Industry Awards, and she managed to write a memoir biography on J.M. Coetzee, published last year in 2018 by Black Ink as well. Now, if you're not as impressed and exhausted as I am by reading this bio out, she's also a regular contributor to The New Yorker, The Monthly, Wired, The Smithsonian Magazine and Good Weekend, with a collection of her profiles of people in unusual careers, inner worlds and outer spaces, published last year by Penguin Random House. Her essays have been selected for the Best Australian Science Writing, Best Australian American and Nature Writing, Best Australian Essays, and she's got a special interest in social justice and environmental ethics in outer space, with her essay, Mining the Moon, recently selected as one of 2 finalists for the prestigious Australian Museum Eureka Awards. Welcome, Ceridwen.
Thank you, Sunil.
Now, Harvard, it's been featured in the novels of Eric Segal. It's pretty much the oldest, well, it is the oldest and most prestigious university in America. Tell us a little bit about your time there and its hallowed halls. What was it like?
The more time passes since then, the more I wonder if I'd read if I actually went there. It was a strange sort of way to get there. My sister and I were at Sydney Girls and we were living alone. Long story that I won't bore you with, but my parents had gone back to South Africa for their jobs, so we were living in a flat across the road from school. And so we were pretty independent. We did our own housework, our own cooking, our own laundry. She did her HSC, and the same year she figured out that she was going to apply to Harvard. She just picked Harvard, nowhere else in America, just Harvard.
Why Harvard?
I don't know, she was the only one she probably knew of. I mean, we were quite naive and, another way. And she figured out how to do her SATs. So while she was doing her trials and we were living alone, she did her SATs. And all of this came from her. My parents didn't even know. And one day she came home and called them in South Africa and said, I've got into Harvard. And they said, oh, honey, I'm so sorry, but there's no ways you can go. We can't afford to send you. And she said, no, don't worry. They've given me full financial aid. And so off she went, and she was so naive. We'd never been to America before. We didn't understand what liberal arts college really was. And so she turned up with a suitcase, and I don't think she even had taken sheets with her for her first night in the dormitories. I think she just hadn't thought that far ahead, and her roommate had to lend her sheets for the first night. And I was very lucky because 2 years later I turned up and my older sister was there, and she coached me on how to do all the applications. And so it was a bit monkey see, monkey do. And so I went and joined her, and we had 2 years where we overlapped, which was really nice.
Now, did you ever feel any pressure given the long roll of eminent, brilliant alumni who've been to Harvard and graduated from Harvard? Did you ever feel any pressure to live up to those expectations of being at Harvard or to make your mark on the world?
No, I think the benefit really, we were the fools rushing in because we honestly did not know what the hell was going on most of the time, and standing outside of a institution that for Americans it was like the Holy Grail. And the longer we spent there, the more we realized, my God, the year I applied from Australia, only 7 other Australians applied to go to Harvard. And because they always wanted a very, diverse student population, 1 in 7 chance, that's pretty good. The odds are good. Whereas we learned how the Americans that we were there with, had almost killed themselves through high school, in these high pressure, high stress situations to get there. I didn't know any of those stories of the eminent people who'd, been at the university. And so I was lucky in that I kind of came to it as a complete innocent, I suppose, or idiot, one of the two. And then I very quickly fell in with a bunch of international students. So I spent most of my time at Harvard in the gumboot dancing group, which was the African Students Association. So, you could kind of curate a very particular experience for yourself, and you could avoid the pockets of dodgy kind of privilege that, did exist, but not to the extent that I think many of us as Australians imagine, because there was so much financial aid given away. The campus was just this incredibly diverse place. It was very different to say, like a Princeton campus or Dartmouth, which are traditionally much more sort of fancy American schools, and with fraternity and sorority system that dominate the social life on campus. And Harvard was kind of like a bunch of nerds geeking out and finding their bliss, in the random things that we were doing, and then these little pockets that you would occasionally sort of brush up against and get a sense of a whole nother system of power that was operating. But most of the time, because you all lived in the same dormitories, you ate the same meals in the same dining halls, your backgrounds were sort of elided in that way. You could kind of, it was a sort of equalizer, even though, it was this beautiful campus. But still, you're hanging around in your pajamas. It was only often when I went home with American friends for Thanksgiving or for spring break that I would sometimes suddenly see, oh my God, this family, owns half of Newport Beach in California, or, it would just be a sort of strange opening into a very foreign kind of world. But I was studying anthropology, so for me that was just catnip, because all I wanted to do was fieldwork all the time, which is essentially lurking around people, pretending to be a part of something, but actually you're on the outside. So that idea of participant observation, for me, actually finding anthropology, I think, was a lifesaver, because it meant I could intellectualize my social awkwardness.
Now, you happen to also be at Harvard with a number of contemporaries who've made a major impact on the world. The doctor and writer of The Emperor of All Maladies, Siddhartha Mukherjee, Mark Zuckerberg, you may have heard of him, Natalie Portman, the actress Natalie Portman, and most infamously, Jared Kushner, senior counsel to possibly former US President Donald Trump. Did you ever meet any of them, and what were they like? What pajamas did they wear?
I've got a couple of stories. So it's been a weird thing to talk about with this book. Natalie Portman and Jared Kushner were classmates, and I did know both of them. And there are characters in this book. There's a dark and a light sort of pole of fame. So one character, Fred Reese, who's the son, not the son-in-law of a despised president, who's the sort of infamous dark pool of power and its abuses, and then an actress who comes into her freshman year already famous. But we never hear from them in the book. The characters who the narration is focalized through a friendship group who orbit around Jules, the actress, and they're constantly sort of measuring themselves against, these two poles, and the whole class kind of, because each class is only about 1,600 students. So I thought it was an interesting structure to use, and the fact that the class of 2003 had these two people, one dark and one light, had always intrigued me, and the way that people did measure themselves against them. I haven't told you any of my stories about them, but I wish I had a really bad Jared sort of story, but I have to say he was just always very polite. He had that weird, shiny, boyish face, but that was less weird when he was 20 than it is now that he's 40. So I've got no venal stories about him. And Natalie was lovely, and we were briefly friends, and then I stuffed it up because it's very hard being friends with a famous person.
How'd you stuff it up?
I stuffed it up. So I was coming back to Sydney. My parents had finally moved here, and so I was coming back for the American summer to see them. And she was coming to film Star Wars at the Fox Studios. And so she invited me to come and visit her on the set. But I got so nervous and so anxious, and you feel so awkward in those situations. Like, you know, talk about being an outsider, you know, intruding into places that you shouldn't be. And I made conversation with this old guy on set just because, again, I was feeling awkward and, you know, just trying to be nice. And sort of said, oh, and what do you do on the set? And I didn't realize that it was George Lucas.
That's hardly a hanging offence.
Oh, it was terrible. He sort of stalked off, and I thought, oh no, I've really blown it. And then I was just so embarrassed that when we got back to campus, so she was lovely and smart and nice, and I just sort of never pursued the friendship. That's what you do when you're 20. Yeah.
There is a great scene in the book, isn't there, where one of Jules's friends inadvertently steps over part of the set and embarrasses himself as well. Look, I mean, there are so many obvious parallels between brash, vulgar, hotel-owning President Reese and possibly former US President Donald Trump. Why did you fictionalise America's first reality show president, given that he seems to have fabricated or lied about pretty much everything anyway?
I just felt like we were all spending so much time with him anyway. Like when I was writing this book in 2018, I didn't want to spend any more time with him. And so at least by fictionalizing the president, I could make it a little bit more camp rather than just devastating, you know. And I didn't want this book to be dark and depressing like some of my previous stuff has been. I wanted it to be sort of more accessible, warmer, more fun. I wanted it to be a bit of a fun read. That was what I was wanting in that time. I didn't want to read more about Trump, but I wanted to kill off his son.
Yeah, I think that works in reality as well. I think there's a lot of people... I mean, you've talked about how Life After Truth and every other writing project you write has a different, you know, narrative or authorial voice, going from, you know, the high literary voice of books like Blood, Kin or Only the Animals to something more accessible like Life After Truth. Why do you do that, and what's the difference between each? And what decides which voice you're going to be writing in?
I'm still sort of figuring that out. I did start quite young as a writer. I wrote my first novel when I was about 23. And so, and there've been a lot of mistakes. I feel like the whole, you know, the 20 years has been a kind of apprenticeship where I've been just working on the craft. And because I kept switching between social anthropology and that kind of outwards looking, you know, the lives of others, the interview of other people, you know, how do ordinary people make meaning in their daily lives? Like, that's a very strong interest for me. And then the flexing inwards of the fiction, which often feels quite, or can feel self-indulgent or almost irresponsible because you're just sort of going through the contents of your own mind, and that can feel a bit gross sometimes. So I used to think, I think I need to pick one or the other. You know, I think I have to sort of decide which of these voices I'm gonna, but they kept coming out. And then of course there's the, you know, survival thing. So there's the hustle of having to write, and so writing for money, and so the, you know, nonfiction, often that's what that's about, and profiling people. And then trying to hoard a little bit of time for the creative work that will maybe go nowhere after 3 years of, you know the drill. But yeah, one good thing about getting a little bit older, I just turned 40 last week, is that I'm not too worried about that anymore. Just, you know, I contain multitudes and all that, and I think the two voices are going to be there. They both seem to be sticking around for now. And in the fiction, for some reason, I don't know why, but every book I write is completely different. And I know that makes, you know, my job, or my publisher's job, a bit hard, because in the industry that we're in, often people want the same thing from authors that they like, or they want to know what they're getting, you know, each time. And I can't give you a reason for that, except that I suppose I'm not in the camp of writing, you know, what you know, but more writing towards what you want to know. And so that curiosity that's sort of propelling whichever voice it is, I guess I just would get bored if I kept doing the same thing.
So you've talked about the social anthropology, both in terms of personal experience and in terms of your work. How does that inform your fiction and vice versa?
I think it really is just that I am now used to being in that liminal space. It's probably where I feel most comfortable. It can be a bit lonely sometimes if there are writers in the room. Drusilla's over there. You know, I think most writers are kind of anthropologists of a kind. Obviously, I chose not to go down the academia route with the anthropology, but I draw on it every single day. And as a practice where your body, yourself, is a legitimate tool of learning and knowledge, that's pretty unusual even in the social sciences. And it's something I'm grateful that I learned early on, and learned that, you know, there was a way that to do this thing where you could just sometimes, if you were lucky, get to eavesdrop on other people's experiences. And for me, that's whether it's the nonfiction or the fiction. I'm always trying to make sense of how any of us really makes it through life. Life's never easy for anybody. And I think with this book, maybe explicitly, it's almost like a self-help novel. I did wonder when I was writing it if you could write like self-help fiction. So all of the characters in the book are having a version of a midlife crisis. But it's not all bad, you know, it can be incredibly invigorating. And I was particularly interested in, for the women, you know, there's very little about midlife crises for women, what that feels like, what the emotional texture of that is like, what it's like to have an intellectual midlife crisis, not just a hormonal one, which is generally what people talk about when they talk about women getting older. And so my hope is that maybe in reading the book, and one of the characters is actually a professor of happiness, so she's thinking about these things even more explicitly and sort of drawing on philosophers who, you know, have some great advice. Like my favorite is that you can't live the second half of your life in the same way that you've lived the first.
Oh God, I think it would exhaust me.
But it's hard to find new ways of living and being. And yeah, I know 40 is very, very young in this world that we live in, but there's something about that milestone where people, you know, my peers, whether it's the Americans that I saw at my 15-year reunion when I went back and, you know, saw what they were doing and how they were dealing with that, or if it's my Australian peers, it's just a weird time, but it throws up a lot of great stuff as well.
So what was your 15th year Harvard reunion like? I mean, had you been to any others before that?
I had gone to the 5-year, which was, all about sort of performative jockeying of achievement and, you know, drinking. And then I'd left America, so I hadn't gone to the 10-year. And so when I went back for the 15-year, I barely slept that weekend because I was so excited to be overseas. I'd had 2 kids. I'd been basically stuck in pajamas for, 5 years and hadn't traveled anywhere. And this was the first trip I ever did without the family. And I hadn't been back to America in about 12 years. And it was just very strange because you can choose to sleep in the same little beds in the same dormitories that you were once sleeping in as a student. And not everybody chooses that option, but I was like, yes, please, sign me up. And so I was lying there in this little tiny, single bed. All the smells are the same, the lights the same, the lamps are the same. And two of my old roommates, we were in the same room, so I could hear them snoring, and we were all negotiating the use of the shower again. And very much a sensory overload, where any reunion, as we all know, brings up a lot. It's a very emotional experience, but to then have 3 days living back in the very site of your youth and having that kind of, so I didn't sleep because I was horribly jet lagged, but then I was also just so overstimulated by this experience. And I had never intended to write a novel about this, and I had this sort of weird weekend of just, I wasn't sure if I was Arthur or Martha, just sort of wandering around campus and bumping into people, and people were oversharing the most extraordinary stuff about their lives and their difficulties, and people have become so much more honest and open since the 5 year, and just had a wonderful weird time, and then got back to Sydney and didn't sleep for 6 months, firstly because I was jet lagged, and then I had this weird insomnia, and I don't know if it was linked to realizing, oh shit, I have to write a novel about this, but yeah, so it was written in a very weird twilight sort of, when you're going through periods of insomnia like that, I don't know if anybody here has, it's sort of the perfect conditions under which to write a novel. I highly recommend it. Someone told me afterwards that Barbara Kingsolver had written the Poisonwood Bible when she had the most terrible pregnancy insomnia. So for 9 months she had barely slept, and that's when that book came out. It came out of that, and yeah, I wouldn't maybe want to go through it again, but the way that fiction, you're having to kind of dig down, and you are in a sort of hazy.
And you are in that liminal space between consciousness and unconsciousness, subconsciousness, and
so all those barriers were just gone because I was so tired, and
Although now, before I go to bed, I have to put on so many appliances like the CPAP machine and the bite guard and the nose clamps and the knee pillow.
White noise.
I'm like a Lego project before I put the doona on. It's interesting though, isn't it? Because I've often thought that we might be the last generation of people to actually lose touch. Thanks to your classmate, Mark Zuckerberg, my children will never ever lose touch with their classmates on Facebook or social media or whatever. And yet I know that when I went to my 20-year reunion, there were people, I don't know if you found this when you went to your 15th, or if you guys have ever had this experience as well, but I remember there were people that I kept in touch with, so I wasn't worried about meeting up with them again. And there were people that I had, when they came up to me, I went, oh wow, I haven't thought about you once in the last 20 years. There were people who came up to me and I had no idea who they were, and there were people I had thought about all through that 20 years that I was really hoping to meet, and I had no idea I would ever see again. Some of whom turned up and some of whom didn't. Do you think there's still a kind of, we need to have reunions? Why do we need these reunions?
We like to punish ourselves, I think. They can be deeply unpleasant experiences. They can be wonderful experiences. They can be, traumatic. They can be invigorating. But I think it's the ritual. It's the ritual nature of it. That's what makes it special. It's the time has passed and that you will be put together, but in a bounded situation. So it's not like you're just bumping into someone on the street. It's the ritualized nature of you will all come back together and you will have the same conversation 20 times in one night. And, the same kind of order of proceedings will happen at every reunion. They're all the same. I mean, it's a bit like going to church. And I think there's something really valuable in that. And that's where the checking in with yourself, if you can use it as an opportunity for that, to just check in on where you're at and who you were the last time you went to that reunion, then I think it's worth doing.
Well, I'll never be that thin again, and I won't get the hair back either. I mean, okay, so now when you turned 40, what was it like for you? I mean, you're so successful and well-travelled and accomplished, Ceridwen. Apart from Natalie Portman, what regrets did you have when you turned 40? Or were they not important anymore?
God, of course I've got regrets. I mean, the biography you read was very nice, but very cringy for me. You know, that's over 20 years, and honestly, I'm still learning, and I'm definitely in the throes of a midlife crisis. So, yeah, I have no answers for any of it, but I'm really lucky that I have writing fiction. I don't know what people do if you don't write fiction. How do you figure stuff out? I mean, that's how I
Apparently
figure everything out.
you do Pilates and have a social life.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, maybe I'm the one missing out, but I just truly don't know how I would get through life without it. And so, yeah, it's this wonderful thing that and reading is the same, you know, and you're all here because you love reading. And what reading gives us all is a rehearsal space for life. So it's like a safe space where you can try out, you know, interactions and relationships and emotions, and without actually, you know, those things having consequences or negative consequences on real people. And if you then, you know, every writer comes to writing through reading. And so, you know, you start as a reader who just is obsessive about it. And then one day you realize, wow, you know, if you could give somebody that experience, if you could give them that little rehearsal space for real life, it's a wonderful thing.
You know, it's interesting because my mother, who just had her 79th birthday and is retired, now, she talks all the time about her childhood and her early adulthood in a way she never did before. You know, that secret history that I could only guess at or imagine, she's now starting to share with me. And she's never been happier. Never been happier at all. Studies have suggested that people in their 30s and 40s are the most unhappy of all. Why do we seem to regret so much, you know, in our 30s and 40s? Why do we have that midlife crisis?
Well, I think it's not that you're regretting things necessarily. I think it's that you just slammed. You know, you're in those sandwich years of just like trying to make a living, trying to raise a family, trying to self-actualize. You know, none of that stuff is always fun to do. You know, it's bloody hard work, all of it. But you're also then, I suppose, having to let go of the unlived lives. So if the regret comes into it, I think it's around midlife when you really, if you're going to, you know, proceed as a mature adult, have to let go of the unlived lives. And that's hard. You've got to sort of grieve that. But the good news is that 60 to 70 is people's favorite decade, as long as you have good health and enough to survive off, in studies of human happiness over, you know, a life course.
But that's, you know, baby boomers who paid their house off and have got 2 investment properties. What about the rest of us? I'm a freelance writer. I've only got 50,000 in my super and 2 working kidneys.
But it's the child raising. Child raising makes people joyful and deeply unhappy at the same time. And a book that I credit at the back here that I recommend you all read is called All Joy and No Fun. It's a portrait of modern parenthood. It's sort of an ethnography of parenthood by an American woman called Jennifer Senior. And yeah, parenting sucks. I mean, it's like meant to be the hardest work on earth. There's a reason why it is. But, you know, I think it's a huge relief if you've decided to have children, no matter, you know, yes, it brings your life a lot of meaning, but it's also a relief when you're no longer, you know, responsible for these other human beings and just the daily slog of the work.
Yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it? Like, the 3 best days of my life were my wedding day and the births of my children. So if I hear of someone getting married or having a baby, I'm so excited, but I never want to get married again or have another baby. No. I mean, it's interesting what you're saying about the meaningfulness and the joy of parenthood, because 2 of your characters in the book, wrestle with the fact that they do something very meaningful, working among, in their community to protest, to community action, organising, to work in a disadvantaged school. And even when we look at, say, writing or things that give us meaning, they often seem to be very thankless, minimally rewarded. Where can we find that meaning? I mean, Jomo selling jewellery to celebrities has this amazing life, flitting around the world, whereas his contemporary, Rowan, struggles, thinking about the fact that maybe he made the wrong choices in terms of wanting to go for meaning over money. How can we keep going through meaning, and how does Rowan feel about it?
I love that Rowan has the opposite of what most people think should happen in midlife. He's lived this really great life. He's tried to be a good man, a good partner, a good person. And then he goes to his 15-year reunion and he's just like, oh shit, I got the wrong memo. Everybody else got it right and they've all gone off and made money. And I was searching for meaning and I don't want any more meaning. I just want some money. And he was a very fun character to write.
Can we meet Rowan?
You want to hear from him, Rowan? Okay.
In the book. This is Rowan reflecting on the choices he's made, his regrets.
Can everyone hear okay? Is the sound on? Okay. So this is on the Friday evening of the reunion weekend. The private dining room of the restaurant within the Charles Hotel, one level beneath the hotel lobby, was even more lavish than Rowan had imagined. The decor made him feel as if he were in the lost underwater city of Atlantis. Instead of windows, there were tanks built into the walls, filled with psychedelically coloured fish. The backlighting sent ripples of bluish light across the room. Before the endless platters of food had started arriving, there'd been an arrangement of marine coral on their table, which the server had spirited away like a merman. It was the first official night of reunion weekend, when friends from all classes, though tilting toward an older, wealthier crowd, met here for an early dinner before going to their respective cocktail parties, each held at a different venue around the university. Jomo must have pulled some strings to reserve the private room for one of the most sought-after slots in the restaurant's calendar, Rowan thought. Jules's name would have done it, but Jomo would never drop her name as a matter of principle. The 15-year cocktail party later that night would be held in the Barker Centre, which reflected how low they still were in the hierarchy of reunions. The building had an attractive outlook, but it was a far cry from, say, the main reading room within Widener Library, which some historian or other had described as the most ostentatious interior space at Harvard. Mint green inlaid panels on the curved ceiling and gold lampshades. For that privilege, they'd have to wait a couple more decades. Their 10th reunion drinks, Rowan recalled, had been held at the Woodbury Poetry Room. Though small, it was a nice space made colourful by the jackets of the vinyl records stacked on its shelves. Rowan had spent a lot of time there as an undergraduate, listening to the scratchy recordings of poets reading their work aloud, enraptured by the sound of their voices. It's a curious place, Harvard, his favourite poet, Robert Creeley, had once said in his ear, as if he were in the room beside him. He'd been 20 years old when he took that course on Creeley and the other Black Mountain poets. Creeley had never graduated, put off by the sardonic stance of his Harvard professors. Rowan had been luckier. His teachers had been the opposite of sardonic. The professor teaching the class had encouraged them to memorize Myself, a famous Creeley poem about getting older. But Rowan could recall exactly none of its lines, only that he'd liked the poem as a student because it implied that middle age did not bring with it any special wisdom. Yet it was one thing to celebrate while he was still young, that age would not bring clarity about how to live. These days he would prefer to believe that it would. The poets who extolled this as the truth were the ones he now wanted to read. But who were they? He couldn't think of any. The ancients, perhaps? No. The Greek lyric poets were damning about middle and old age. He knew that much. They classified the old and the young into two separate species. All the good things belonged to the heroic young. He gazed at the fish in the tank set into the wall. He recognized a few of the varieties. He'd done copious research before venturing to the pet store to buy Alexis some fish for her 5th birthday. She'd initially wanted a dog, and then they'd tried to talk her into stick insects or a few hermit crabs with numbers cutely painted on their shells, but apparently they had a high risk of dehydrating. So Rowan had deftly drawn Alexis's attention to 2 goldfish, one big, one small, that were hiding in some water weeds. "Look, honey," he'd said, "a daddy fish and a daughter fish, just like you and me." And his ploy had worked. They had returned home with the 2 goldfish in a bag and instructions on how to set up the smallest tank the shop had for sale. Alexis had named the big one Mr. Webster for him and the little one Lexi for her. What Rowan had not anticipated was how much he would worry over the welfare of these 2 dumb creatures, in particular over Lexi, once they were in his care. He'd begun to dread going into the girl's room in the mornings, convinced that Lexi would be floating on the surface while Mr. Webster, fat and happy, would still be alive. It wasn't for his daughter's sake that he was concerned. It would be good for her, he knew, to experience death on that small scale with low-stakes grief. It was for his own sake. He'd so successfully anthropomorphized the 2 fish that he'd begun to harbor a superstition that whichever goldfish died first would foretell how it happened in real life. Him or Alexis, Mr. Webster or Lexi. So one Saturday morning, while Mariam was out doing the grocery shopping and the girls were watching TV, he'd taken matters into his own hands. He'd scooped Mr. Webster out from the hollow underwater pineapple he called home and flushed him down the toilet. The relief he'd felt afterward was terrific. A father should always, always die before his child. When a replacement goldfish was purchased, Rowan had closely supervised the naming choice. Alexis had settled on Fishtastic. Now he felt nothing when he went into her room in the mornings to feed the fish, even when Lexi seemed to recognize him, coming up to the surface with her mouth open, eager for breakfast, or for information about what fate had befallen old Mr. Webster. Rowan scanned the restaurant. Across the room, twirling squid ink pasta onto his fork, was Frederick P. Reese II. Rowan eyed him spitefully. What did the P even stand for? Some waspy name like Philip or Petersham or Prendergast? Rowan watched as Fred chewed and wished that he could make things happen, make objects move, energies shift through the intensity of his feelings. Hatred was a bizarre emotion. When it was really upon you, in you, as it was in Rowan right then, it felt almost cleansing. Like love, it was a hot emotion. No wonder the common expression for it was that hatred bubbles like oil in a pan. Perhaps that's what it felt like to murder someone out of pure hatred, like spontaneously combusting. In retrospect, with the benefit of hindsight, it was always so simple to identify what might count as a necessary evil. Would the people of the future imagine time traveling back to this moment to murder Fred Reese? Would they wish they could stand in the center of this underwater room and shout "J'accuse" to every single person in it who was nibbling on arancini instead of slitting Fred Reese's throat? He was about to indulge this murderous fantasy even further and plot how, having dealt with Fred, he would somehow get close enough to President Reese to off him too. They were a hydra after all, and both heads needed to be cut off, when Jomo interrupted his thoughts by tapping his wineglass with a fork.
Oh my God, it felt like my Twitter feed just then. I mean, It's interesting, isn't it? In regards to regret, I was thinking about that while we've been talking about how regret is almost like our own fictional impulse. You know, that past conditional, that perfect past where if we hadn't made that one decision, we would have not made any of the other poor decisions that may have followed it. You know, if we'd married that person, or we hadn't, or we had taken that job or not. So it's interesting about the novel because, you know, for example, Graham Greene, who alternated between what he spoke of as his literary works and his, you know, entertainments, wrote his novel The Third Man, but it was based on his screenplay of the film of the same name. Now, Life After Truth actually appeared as an audiobook before it became an actual book. Why is that?
So I think the reason I had the insomnia when I was writing it was that I was aware that it was in such a different writing voice to the previous fiction that I had written, which tended to be sort of high literary, in a high literary voice, for better or worse. And it wasn't that it was in a different genre, it was just a different voice. And I didn't know, you know, there's no real way as an author to signal that, except by publishing under a pseudonym, which I initially tried to do.
What was your pseudonym?
Well, there's a longer story behind that. Yeah, Ty Merrick. It sounds silly now, but yeah, Ty Merrick was the name I wanted to use for this novel. And I actually submitted it to some publishers under a pseudonym. But I didn't want to call it a pseudonym because pseudonym, obviously, you know, its meaning is false, a false name. And it implies a kind of deceit that you're hiding something. And people had a very negative response to it, as if, you know, it was like, what are you hiding? What are you ashamed of? Or what are you afraid of? Or, and nobody could have the conversation with me of, you know, no, it's just a different writing voice. That's all. It's just a signal code switching thing. And I tried to then go into that it's not a pseudonym, but a heteronym, because this Portuguese poet called Fernando Pessoa, who I love, he died in about the 1930s. He had about 12 different heteronyms, and they were all poets, and they all wrote in these different voices. So it's not that he was writing different genres of poetry, but they all had different conditions of creation. They had different... they just expressed themselves differently on the page. And he used to have a lot of fun with them. He used to have them like write about each other, horrible letters, you know, to editors, or sometimes they were friends, sometimes they were enemies. They would write letters to each other, you know, that no one else would ever read. And he wasn't mad, as far as I know. And so I thought I loved this idea of heteronyms, and that this would be the first of many heteronyms that I might, you know, use over the course of a lifetime of writing. For me, that felt like a wonderful kind of opening up. But anyway, no one else thought that was a wonderful opening up. And so I quickly realized that actually the book was going to go under my bed, because I just couldn't see a way forward to doing it. And then through a very random twist of fate, Audible Australia was looking for novels that they could publish as Audible Originals, I think they were called. And the idea was that these books would be audio first novels. So, you know, it was just as the audio landscape was getting really interesting, and people were sort of seeking out you know, listening experiences. And so it was a bit of an experiment, because traditionally, if you published a novel in print, you know, the audiobook would then be a pale imitation of the print text. It would come out after the fact, and it would only be, you know, this sort of minor, lesser art form in a way, compared to the text. You know, the text was very much the dominant main thing. And so I thought, what a fabulous way to literally signal this is in a different voice, is to just have it exist only in voice. And so I said yes. It was a big risk, big creative risk.
How did your publishers at Penguin or your agent react to you wanting to be audio first?
Yeah, fine. I mean, it's complicated. Publishers now are not delighted to take on a book where they don't have audio rights. So for instance, this book, I have no American publisher for it, even though it's all American characters set in America, and it's because Audible has the audio rights. So I have paid a price for that experiment. It's just, American publishers were like, absolutely not. If the audio rights have been partitioned out, we will not do it as a print book. So I was very lucky that here, Penguin Random House was open to waiting a year for the audiobook and then doing it as the print book, which is what it was always intended to be. But it has had this other journey, which has been really fun. And I've actually done another novel called Once More with Feeling, and it's only ever going to exist as an audio novel. So it's on Audible Originals. So I kind of love that it's just circulating in this totally different way, and that's also in a different voice. It's also in this sort of warmer, more accessible voice. It's a novel set in Sydney. It's actually the first time I've ever written about Australians, all Australians, and a wonderful narrator who did it, called Jason Chong, who he really brought the book alive. And I actually think it works much better as a heard novel than as a novel on the page. So it's fun to have, as a writer, it's fun to have another art form to experiment in.
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because when we think of literature, even when we look at, say, the way that epic poetry was written, it was always a transcription of an oral tradition. But when we were writing Once More with Feeling, with an ear to the audio, how did that influence in terms of the relationship between the page and audio? Because I know that when I've adapted written stuff or stuff that I've written for the page for audio, there's been a lot of elision, a lot of editing and stuff like that.
Well, that novel also was one of the ones, I actually have the linen press where you keep pillow slips and sheets and things. That's where my novels go to die. So Once More with Feeling had also been written as a print novel, but it had gone into the shelf of novels to die because it was in this other voice. A lot. And this is what I mean about these different voices.
I don't know where you get the time to do it. You've got 2 kids under 10.
But this is over 20 years, It's so Once More with Feeling I'd written 8 years ago, and then it had gone into the linen press to die because I was like, I don't know what to do with this novel that's in this other voice that I'm really proud of and that I like. But because it doesn't fit with the high literary stuff, I don't know what to do with it. So it hadn't even been written for audio. Then the edit was interesting because we did edit it for audio. And I suppose it's just about it was lucky in that I tend not to write a lot of in real time scenes because I'm very bad at dialogue. So I try and write around, you write around your own failings as a writer. And so I tend to avoid dialogue, and I tend to avoid a lot of scene setting. I like doing the reminiscing. So a lot of the book is actually reminiscing about past stuff because you can jump forward and back. I never know how to get characters out of a scene. Once they're in a scene, I'm like, God, we're really stuck here for a while, and I don't know how to get them out. But for whatever reason, Once More with Feeling, I had written more scenes, and then I had to write some more dialogue when we were adapting it to the audio book.
Now, I've got more questions, but I imagine you do too. If you've got a question for Ceridwen, please do ask us a question here in the Royal Oak or on Facebook Live. If you do ask a question here, I will repeat it for everyone at home on Facebook Live. Any questions for Ceridwen?
Can you tell us more about what is a midlife intellectual crisis? I've never heard of this.
Well,
so what's a midlife
this is my point.
Crisis?
No, I just coined that term.
Tell us more.
Okay, so I'll just repeat that for everyone.
Okay.
What is a midlife intellectual crisis? How
Yeah,
does it work?
I don't know either. It's just that I feel like I'm going through one, and that part of it is this voices thing. Like felt like a decision that had to be made, or a clarity that I had to either have the guts to just say, you know what, these voices all come out, and I can't be a snob about them, or let go of writing to impress other people, specifically my mother. And I say that with great love and respect, but she was a very serious literary critic. I mean, she was the first person to write about James Coetzee the South African, now Australian Nobel laureate. This was back in the 80s before he was known anywhere else. And if I look back at some of my earlier stuff, I think I'm sort of writing for her. I'm writing in a style that, you know, I'm basically trying to copy J.M. Coetzee, which is impossible to do because he's a genius. So I don't know, but I think there needs to be more about it. There's quite a bit about men having their, you know, intellectual midlife crises. I wrote a little Guardian essay a couple of weeks ago about Jung and Kant, who both had midlife crises. This was long before the term was known. The term was only coined in the 1960s. But around 40, they both went through an intellectual midlife crisis where they had a complete sort of, and not a mental breakdown, but they just had a complete rethinking of what they were doing, broke with past traditions, broke with mentors who were no longer speaking the same sort of language as them, and then after a period of, you know, painful rethinking, ended up doing some of the best work of their careers. But I really looked for a similar kind of story about women, you know, who've lived a life of the mind, and what happens at 40 when you suddenly maybe have a bit more freedom from the, you know, demands of parenting. What do you do with that? How do you incorporate a kind of philosophical approach to aging? Like all of that. I couldn't find much about that. So yeah, I hope to, the plan actually was to try and write a new novel after each reunion. So every 5 years, go back to the reunion, and a bit like the 7-Up series, if you've watched Michael Apted. I love those documentaries, and just this idea of checking back in with a group of people and using that framing as a lens to look at the time of life that I happen to be in as well. And God knows how many years I have, but that was kind of the idea. And in that series, I really want to look at particularly the female characters and you know, how they're making sense of their lives, and not just the traditional thing of, you know, menopause and caring for elderly parents and adolescent children, but the kind of, yeah, the intellectual life that if they're lucky enough to be leading one. Yeah.
I'm always struck by that quote by Mark Twain, who said, when I was 20, I was always outraged by how little my father knew. And when I turned 40, I realised how much he'd learnt in that time. Although if eye rolling was an Olympic sport, my children would get podiums. Okay, so speaking of the novel, we've got a question from Tanya. Who do you relate to most of any of the characters in the novel?
I just put little bits of myself in all of them, and that's, you know, that's really the truth. I took the emotional experiences from the reunion, but all of the characters are built completely from scratch, and writers say that and no one believes them, but it is the truth. Some of my roommates read the book in a very early draft, and they were like, we were there by your side for all of this, and we know all the people that you know, and who are these people, you know? And I was like, excellent, this is great. Other than the little, you know, hints of the two famous people in our class, but again, it's not based on them, it's just the idea of their fame. So yeah, I just kind of, it was fun to put bits of myself in, like the men and, you know, and the women across the different careers that they're in, and I had, yeah, I think all of them would be the answer.
Thanks, Tanya. Great question. Any other questions for Ceridwen?
So the other novel that I read about Harvard was A Little Light by, I think, Gattaca. So is there, was it your publisher who chose, or your editor who chose the title of your book, or is there sort of any connection between life and being a Harvard student?
So I'll just ask that for everyone at home. So the only other Harvard set novel that this lady's read is The Little Life by
Hanya, yes, I can't say that.
So obviously a very harrowing novel, my wife tells me. How about this? How did you choose the title? Was it a suggestion from your publisher, from Audible, or how did you come up with it?
Yeah, no, I actually have not read that novel because I can't read it about anything bad happening to children. I just can't do it. So I hadn't even made that connection, actually, that the title is... No, I came up with the title. I was very pleased with myself for its double meaning. Veritas is the Latin motto of Harvard from the 1600s. So life after Harvard, and then the post-truth world that we all now live in thanks to Trump. So yeah, but thanks. I hadn't actually made that connection. I was thinking a lot about Donna Tartt and A Secret History and the campus murder mystery and David Lodge's murder mystery, which is sort of like an intellectual history as well, as is A Secret History. So I wanted to bring in bodies of knowledge, but through a sort of fun, you know, it's not a murder mystery, but there is a dead body in the book. So.
Any other questions for Ceridwen? Ceridwen, I have to ask, you know, Salman Rushdie, you've grown up you were born in South Africa, grew up between South Africa and Australia, studied in the US, you had formative periods of your life across 3 different continents. Salman Rushdie once said in his seminal essay, Imaginary Homelands, that, you know, the space between 2 stools, or falling between that space, is a fertile place for a writer to be, or an anthropologist. How do those different kind of places and cultures kind of inform your identity and the way you see each? You know, going back to America, are you still an outsider? Going back to South Africa, are you still an insider? How does that inform your identity and the way you relate to these places that have been so formative to you?
No, I think I'm just an outsider everywhere. But saying that, you know, I have the privilege of being white, speaking English as a first language, and so I can't really claim that moving between, you know, those countries, it's all countries that have, you know, a similar history of, you know, colonialism, and I can't claim that was a painful experience for me, in the sense that it is for many, many writers who are having to kind of, you know, through their writing, actually weave back together an identity, you know, put themselves back together from scratch after incredibly traumatic experiences of, you know, migration and forced migration. And so it's not that. I think it's just the sense of, never taking things at surface value. Someone described me as an Antipodean writer.
Yeah, what does that mean
recently
to you?
They meant it as an insult, because it was an American, and it was actually about a space piece that I had written, and they meant like, oh, you're a woman and a novelist and you're Antipodean and you shouldn't weigh in on these things. But I love the term Antipodean, because if you look at Shirley Hazzard's sense of the word, and I learned this from Michelle de Kretser, wrote a beautiful book on Shirley Hazzard called On Shirley Hazzard, as part of the Writers and Writers series. And an Antipodean way of seeing in Shirley Hazzard's work is a radical way of interrupting the smooth acceptance of things. I think that's Hazzard's words exactly. Never accepting the status quo, or never accepting what you're being told. I think there's something really valuable in that, and it's something I very much identify with now. And I feel fully Australian in that sense. If I can be Antipodean in that sense of standing outside of the centres of power and looking in with a sceptical eye, then I embrace being Australian.
Well, we're very much looking forward to Once More with Feeling, your first Australian set book. Can you tell us a little bit about it before we finish?
Once More with Feeling? Once More with Feeling is about an elderly man and an elderly woman who fall in love when he fails his compulsory 85-year driving test. You know, you've got to do a practical driving test. And there's a bit of a dying with dignity theme in the book, but again, it's not meant to be dark or depressing, but just about a family. And happy, a bit happy, a bit sad. Yeah.
Well, we look forward to it. We'll keep an ear out. And you do too on Audible as well. You can find out more about Ceridwen and her work, including her acclaimed books like Blood Kin and Only the Animals, or her essays and articles on subjects as diverse as reading, smelling, and space from an Antipodean perspective at ceridwendovey.com. Life After Truth is published by Penguin Books, and Ceridwen will be available for a chat and maybe some Harvard gossip about what kind of pyjamas Natalie Portman liked to wear during their brief friendship, when she signs your copy, which you can buy tonight. Now, if you're watching us on Facebook Live, you can also get a signed copy by ordering in the comments or the link to the Roaring Stories online store, where you can also sign up for our newsletter packed with exclusive offers, new releases, reviews, interviews with, and articles by your favourite writers. And if you're here at the Royal Oak, don't forget to pick up the Christmas catalogue. There's something in there for everyone, including Life After Truth by Ceridwen Dovey. You can also pop in the store or buy on the Roaring Stories website. And if you're in Balmain and surrounding suburbs, postage is free. I'm Sunil Badami, and it's been a real pleasure to have your company again at another Roaring Stories online author event. And I hope we'll see you again next week for the last one of the year, where the legendary historian, speechwriter and wordsmith Don Watson will be chatting to the wonderful Eleanor Hall about his latest collection of wit, wisdom, words and diverse pleasures, Watsonia, next Monday, the 23rd of November. Or else I hope to see you round the hood or in the store. Thanks a lot.